The desert rain frog is a tiny frog that lives in a narrow strip of land by the coast of Namibia in South Africa. You might know it from a viral video showcasing its high-pitched squeak. But like everything else, size can be misleading, and a small amphibian can be a great friend to have. And finding out about a frog might just prevent you from croaking. Back in 5th grade, my best friend was Carlos, and we were usually the troublemakers in class. We never got in serious trouble, but we'd frequently make our moms and teachers mad. However, there was one day that our goofing off legitimately might have saved us from getting kidnapped, or worse. It was the afternoon and we were in science class. Our teacher, Mrs. Riley, told us we each had to do a report on a specific animal, but that we could work in pairs if we wanted to. We couldn't just choose any old animal though, we had to pick from a list. By the time Carlos and I got up to pick our animal, there were only like 5 left. Carlos picked the desert rain frog, with his logic being that since it was an unusual animal, Mrs. Riley might not be familiar with it, and wouldn't be as harsh if we got some of the facts wrong. I'm not sure if that would have made a difference, but it didn't matter. Mrs. Riley gave us the rest of class to get started, which was like 30 minutes. Our class had a few computers on a table in the back, and Carlos and I immediately ran over there and got one. Like most schools, there was software to prevent kids from doing bad things, but with a bit of effort you could bypass it. There was a list of allowed websites and resources, but Carlos managed to get a page with funny videos of animals, including desert rain frogs. When we clicked on it, Carlos and I both started cracking up. We had no idea those little frogs made really high-pitched squeaks. Mrs. Riley said sternly from across the room that whoever was using the sound and laughing needed to stop immediately. Carlos muted the video, and we both tried to contain our laughter. He logged into his drive and created a new Word document, then started typing 1 or 2 sentences so that we could all tab over to make it look like we were working. We clicked back on the video, and despite having the sound off, we started laughing loudly again. Then we both froze as we heard Mrs. Riley push her chair back and get up, no doubt about to walk over. But just as she stood up, she let out a gasp. The whole class turned to look, and a moment later saw what she was looking at. Outside one of the windows was a man, wearing a black hoodie, apparently trying to pry open the window. The windows weren't locked, however they were difficult to open from the outside. Some of the kids in our class started screaming, but Mrs. Riley put forth an amazing amount of bravery and walked over to the window and locked it. The man immediately ducked down out of sight, and soon after we saw him running around the side of the building through the other window. Mrs. Riley quietly locked the remaining window and door and turned the lights off, telling us to be quiet and sit against the wall. Then she called the office and explained what happened. Not even 30 seconds later, we heard the announcement that the school was going into lockdown mode and that this wasn't a drill. However, nothing could have prepared us for what we heard next. From somewhere further away in the building, we heard someone banging on a window, followed by screaming. Then there was the sound of glass breaking, and after that, 2 gunshots. The screaming intensified, and several of our classmates started screaming too. Mrs. Riley tried her best to help us remain calm, but I'm sure she was terrified as well. A minute later, we heard shouting and could make out the phrase, "Drop your weapon." We didn't hear much after that, and we sat there in silence and darkness for what seemed like an hour. Eventually there was another announcement, telling us to remain calm and that the danger was over, and that our parents were being contacted and would be picking us up. Then another teacher knocked on our room, and Mrs. Riley opened the door. A few minutes later, we picked up our stuff and walked out single file. It was such a weird and surreal scene, seeing everyone walking into the main part of the school after what had just happened. A lot of parents were already at the front of the building, picking up their kids. When I saw my own mom, she was hysterical, and I quickly said goodbye to Carlos and ran towards her. The school was open the next day, though the principal told us that it would be fine if we needed to take a few days off, or speak with the counselor before resuming our classes. Eventually we found out more of the backstory, including the fact that the man had a criminal history including armed robbery and aggravated assault. After leaving our window, the man had made his way to the front of the school. One of the office staff members managed to lock both sets of double doors at the main entrance, and when the man got there, he started pounding on the doors and yelling to let him in. That's when people started screaming. Then the man broke one of the windows and reached inside, and when he couldn't unlock the door, he fired 2 shots into the lock. Apparently the door still didn't open, and at that point the man tried to run away. But it didn't matter though, since the police had already arrived. I still think about what happened off and on. I'm not sure I was ever afraid for my life, probably because I was younger and the experience seemed so surreal. Still, I can't help but wonder, what if Carlos hadn't played that video and Mrs. Riley hadn't stood up and noticed the man? The story takes place a long time ago when I was in middle school. Just how long ago, I don't want to say. I will say, however, that we'd frequently have to travel to the library to work on reports. For this one project, each person in my class had to make one of those tri-fold displays on one specific type of animal. Our teacher, Mrs. Baker, had given us a list to choose from, and maybe because it sounded interesting, I went with the desert rain frog. However, I started to regret my decision, as I was having trouble finding a lot of information on it in the books/encyclopedias we had in our classroom. Therefore, I asked my mom to take me to the library one afternoon after school. The library was about 30 minutes away, and even though I'd have to walk back since my younger brother had an activity that evening, I figured I could at least get started sooner if my mom dropped me off. I got to the library around 4 and went inside to the reference section. I looked through a few encyclopedias and other books, but still couldn't find what I needed. I walked back to the front of the library where the librarian usually sat. For context, our library wasn't that big, and it wasn't unusual for it to be just the librarian and a handful of people checking out books. When this story took place, I think I was actually the only other person there. I found the librarian, whose name was Miss Lisner. She greeted me, and I told her I needed information on desert rain frogs. Miss Lisner started looking things up in the computer system. She suggested a few books, but after I told her I'd already looked through several encyclopedias, Miss Lisner began searching more in depth. Finally, she found the reference for this book on the wildlife of South Africa, where desert rain frogs apparently live, and she walked with me to help locate it. We started walking between two shelves when Miss Lisner stopped abruptly. At first I thought she found the book, but then she made a gesture with one of her hands and started to back up slowly. I had no idea what was going on, but I followed her lead. Miss Lisner led us to the small break room type area back near the front of the building, and then locked the door and pulled the blinds down over the window part of it. I still didn't know what just happened, but figured it was something serious. Miss Lisner picked up one of the phones and dialed 911. She told the operator that we were walking through the aisles, and then she saw 3 men standing several aisles away. Apparently those men didn't work for the library and hadn't come in through the front doors, meaning they snuck in. But nothing could have prepared me for what Miss Lisner said next. 2 of the men were holding large knives. My heart sank when I heard that. I wanted to start throwing up, but knew we had to stay calm and silent. The operator asked Miss Lisner to remain on the line as the cops came over, and in order to avoid being seen through the window, we sat down on the floor against one of the walls with the lights off. The whole situation seemed so surreal that I didn't even know what to feel in that moment. But then my worst fear came true when I heard banging and yelling coming from another room. It sounded like those men were at the front desk. Miss Lisner spoke frantically into the phone as a moment later we heard a door open and footsteps leading inside. My world shrank to a single point as I heard the doorknob to our room start to turn. Then a bang, followed by another bang. My life flashed before my eyes. But then, miraculously, those men must have decided to leave, because the banging stopped, and we heard footsteps leave the room next to us. There was no way we were moving though, and only when the cops arrived 10 minutes later did we get back up. We unlocked the door and one of the officers came in. We both practically fell into his arms. The cops assured us that we were safe, and a moment later another car drove up and they started searching the building. Miss Lisner and I both gave statements, and a few minutes later one of the cops told her that they didn't find anyone in the building, but asked if there were any hidden rooms. Then Miss Lisner walked around with a cop, while the first officer stayed with me as I called my mom using one of the library phones. Luckily, my mom and brother hadn't left yet, and my mom came straight over. She was hysterical, and really, I was too. We went back home where my mom locked the doors and turned the lights off before our dad got home later that evening. I'm pretty sure he got the handgun they kept locked in their closet and stayed up most of the night on the lookout for those men. It pains me to say this, but they never caught those people. Apparently they were just 3 bums passing through our town, probably looking to rob someone, or worse. I did notice a police car parked out front whenever I went back to the library over the next few months, but eventually they stopped parking there. I know I'm incredibly lucky given what could have happened, and I can't express my gratitude to Miss Lisner for keeping her cool and handling the situation like she did. I also can't help but wonder what would have happened if she hadn't been with me and realized those men were in the library. And that makes me glad I decided to ask her for information on the desert rain frog. I have many vivid memories of traveling with my parents as a child. My parents loved to travel, and they still do, though as I don't live with them anymore, I don't visit other places as much as I did. Every summer, my dad made it a mission to find a relatively inexpensive vacation destination, usually in another country. One summer, I think when I was 11 or 12, he booked a trip for us to go to South Africa. To this day, I'm not sure how we settled on that location, especially since we had no friends or relatives there or any other special connection. Either way, 2 weeks of anticipation and 1 plane ride later, we arrived in Cape Town. Now I don't want to rehash our entire visit, though it was extremely fun. We visited a few national parks and even took a train ride at one point. But what matters for this story is the night we drove out on the sand dunes on the coast. We arrived just in time to see the sunset, which was incredible, and then we kept driving as it became progressively darker. I remember we had the radio on and the windows down, with the warm, moist air blowing through the car. After we'd been driving for 15 minutes or so, my parents parked and we got out to explore the dunes on foot. I started running up and down one of the dunes, and my mom was laughing and chasing after me. My dad was standing on top of one of the dunes, so he could both keep an eye on us as well as watch the car. Eventually my mom and I heard squeaking, which at first we thought was a mouse. It sounded like it was close, so naturally I ran in that direction. My mom followed me, and we were both surprised to see this tiny frog making the high-pitched squeaks. I tried to pick it up, and it started hopping away. We started laughing, and I tried a few more times to pick it up, but then I noticed something in the sand. When I picked that up, I realized it was a knife. My mom started freaking out and took my hand and led me back to the car. My dad saw us and immediately knew something was wrong. He started to ask what, but my mom motioned for him to be quiet, and we got back inside. Only then did she explain that we saw a knife in the sand. At first my dad brushed it off as someone had been trying to hunt or camp, but a moment later he let out a "Holy SHIT" as my mom screamed. I kid you not, there were 5 people now standing on top of the dunes where we'd just been exploring. It was getting dark, so we couldn't make out their features. Based on how they seemed to sneak up on us, I don't think their intentions were good. My dad put the car in drive and floored it, and as we drove off, they started yelling. I looked back and thought I saw one of them lift a knife into the air. Thankfully, we made it back to the hotel without incident, and I don't think we were followed. When we got inside, my dad spoke to someone at the front desk about what just happened, and then that lady called the police. 10 or so minutes later, 2 cops arrived, and after we told them what we saw, they thanked us and said they'd check it out. Maybe this would have put more of a damper on our vacation, but we were already leaving the next day. When we checked out and drove to the airport, it was already well into morning, and my parents had started to calm down from the night before. We checked our luggage and boarded the plane, and a day or so later, we were home. Ultimately, this isn't the scariest childhood memory I have, but it might be the weirdest. Part of what makes it that way is the fact that what happened was so unexpected. Between hearing the squeaks, finding that tiny frog, finding the knife, and getting scared by those people, it all seems so bizarre. Anyway, I'm just glad we made it out all right, and if that frog hadn't led us to find the knife when we did, who knows what might have happened.